中等电广播加华拉要拉上扎罗，刚个路住正业正着你大南大拉塞维正业东个就着是。你接的个拉拉王zan刚大这边做了马人们都等着几十。路做个拉个就打这样拉直接样的送着的这种牛毛。你接着着种子叫马人们些等着你个这你种子了这。多年大家在边大所有的你做这这的我个这着这那这你见这的。Menziran jahara yola andada Omara baza narda 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 Omara baza Mara baza nardo 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 mara baza mara baza nardo tudun jiji jero ozirji dolu dama baraza padan damju jolu doba ludu robe nawa kedo soro janji jimbo tudun ni mejan zone mon jimbo naja Pakaradangan zandu jermodo tomba tiji jala lo 各位佛友，大家晚上好。
Good afternoon, Buddhist friends.
今天我们的这个题目就是投食自我的真相就这么一个题目。那么在这个题目里面呢，我们准备讲佛教讲的这个无我或者是空心就是一个这样子的内容。
The topic for this evening's teaching is the truth of ourselves, and in tonight's teaching I'm going to talk about the Buddhist notions of no self or emptiness, otherwise known as shunyata.
无我或者是这个空心这个内容是佛教里面的一个比较高端的这个课程所以如果是一个初学者，刚刚学佛还没有这个学习只是刚刚从零开始的这样子的这个佛教徒的话，可能也许不是很好理解。
The topics of no self and emptiness are quite advanced lessons in the Buddhist teachings, and so if you are a complete beginner to Buddhism, that is, that you're starting out at complete zero in terms of your knowledge, then it might be that the content of this evening's teaching is not so easy to understand.
我们今天讲这个无我的话，那是最简单的方式最通俗易懂的方式给大家描述。
The way that I am going to introduce these concepts this evening, though, is extremely simple and clear. I'm going to do so in the most accessible manner possible.
因为这个空心它是佛教的精华整个大乘佛教的精华，所以作为一个佛教徒是应该学习的。
Since emptiness, though, is the essence of all of the Mahayana teachings, as Buddhists, it's something that we really do need to learn about.
当然佛教都不是全部都是讲空心我们可以这么分佛教可以分两种不同的层次。
Of course, the entirety of the Buddhist teachings is not devoted to emptiness. It's possible, in fact, to separate the teachings into two kinds.
第一个这个层次呢叫做人天佛教人天佛教它不需要去这个学习空心，它也不需要去了解，它不需要证悟空心不证悟空心的基础上，它可以学一些简单的佛法。
So these two kinds of teaching can be conceptualized as two levels. The first level is that which we refer to as the Buddhism of humans and celestial beings. And at this more basic level of Buddhism, it is not necessary to study emptiness. It's not necessary to realize emptiness. It is possible at this level of Buddhist engagement to learn about other topics and practices.
因为我们每一个人的这个需求和追求都不一样，每个人的这个想法不一样，所以有些人呢，就是学佛的目的是什么呢？就是为了幸福快乐，就是在这个就是为了拥有一个幸福的生活，然后就是比如说心情愉快工作顺利，就是为了一个这样子的目的学佛，没有更高的这个追求。那么这样子的话呢，就不需要学空心。
Everyone has different needs and goals, and everyone has different dispositions too. So there are people who come to Buddhism with the goal of leading a happy life, with the goal of having lives in general, working lives, etc., that are happy and smooth. And beyond this, they don't have any particularly higher spiritual pursuit. And for this kind of Buddhist, it's not necessary to learn about emptiness.
那么这种学佛就需要两个条件，只要具备这个两个条件的话，就可以足够了。
So to study or practice Buddhism at this level, it's only necessary for an individual to fulfill two conditions.
首先第一个是相信轮回，人有前世这个来世相信这个生命轮回，然后再相信善恶因果善有善报，恶有恶报就这个是他的见解，他的观点这是第一个条件。
The first of these conditions is to believe in reincarnation, that is, to believe in transmigration, past and future lives, and to believe in karmic cause and effect. This is essentially the view or the viewpoint of someone practicing at this level, and this is the first condition.
第二个条件就是在日常生活当中尽量的行善断恶，这样子的话，这个就是它的第二个条件只要有这两个条件，就可以学人天佛教更高的，比如说像空心无我呀这些可以不学。
And the second condition is to strive in everyday life to do virtuous deeds and avoid unvirtuous deeds. If both of these conditions are satisfied, then it is possible to practice Buddhism at this level, and it's not necessary to learn about concepts such as emptiness and no self.
我想我们现在的大多数的佛教徒的追求有可能是这一世下一世拥有一个幸福的生活那么这样子的话，这个人天佛教就是适合这种人。我想可能大多数的佛教徒可能比较适合这个人天佛教。
I'd guess that the majority of Buddhists are primarily interested in enjoying happiness in this life and the next life. And if this is the case, then this level of Buddhist practice, the level of humans and celestial beings, is an appropriate path.
然后有另外的一部分的佛教徒他想了解这个自我，了解这个世界，然后就追求智慧追求智慧，追求慈悲心。那么这样子的人就适合学这个无我空心。
But for those Buddhists who seek to gain an understanding and insight into the self, into the phenomenal world, for those who seek wisdom and compassion, then for Buddhists of this nature, or Buddhists who have these goals, it's necessary to learn about no self and emptiness.
那佛教它就像一个超级市场一样里面就有很多的东西那么自己进去了以后就可以选择这里面有很多的选择也可以学大乘佛教，也可以学小乘佛教，也可以学人天佛教整个的佛教所有的佛教都可以包含在这三个佛教当中那么关于学这三个佛教哪一个关于这个学哪一个佛教这方面是佛教是没有一个要求，我们自己去选择。
The Buddhist teachings can be likened to a supermarket with many wares inside. And after one enters the supermarket, one can choose really what one wishes to have. The teachings or the tradition includes the teachings of the Mahayana, the lesser vehicle, the Buddhism of humans and celestial beings. In fact, it's possible to say that all levels of practice are included in these three. And as to which one you decide to study, Buddhism doesn't dictate this. It is entirely up to oneself.
如果我们学大乘佛教的话，那我们的目标是什么呢？就是两个字，智悲智慧和慈悲。佛教徒学大乘佛教的佛教徒就追求什么呢？就追求两个字追求慈悲心，大慈大悲，然后呢追求智慧就追求这两个。
If one decides to pursue Mahayana practice, then this basically entails two goals, and two goals only. That is wisdom, the cultivation of wisdom, and the cultivation of compassion. Wisdom and compassion, just these two things.
那么我们刚才讲的第一个佛教就是人天佛教，这个离我们的生活很近看起来似乎就是很切合实际对我们有很这个离我们很近是这样子的。
So the first level of practice that we just described, the level of humans and celestial beings, looking at this level of practice, it seems to be one that is quite close to our everyday lives.
但是这个人天佛教不能给我们带来大悲心、大慈大悲，还有不能给我们带来智慧。
But this level of practice is not able to give us or enable us to cultivate compassion and wisdom.
所以我们最好就是选择学这个大乘佛教。那么学大乘佛教的话，那么在这个 过程当中，就有很多很多的挑战啊，有很多的挑战，因为它会颠覆我们的三观啊，我们的价值观、人生观啊，以及我们的这个世界观，它都会被颠覆。
The best choice is therefore to choose the path of the Mahayana. But this is a path that has many, many challenges. And the reason for this is because practicing the Mahayana will lead us to overturn our worldview. It will challenge and overturn our existing values and outlook on life.
虽然有很多的挑战但是呢，如果我们学进去了以后呢，确实也是一个非常有趣非常有意义的一件事情。
Even though it entails many challenges, if we are able to study and internalize these teachings, then it's an extremely fascinating and meaningful path of practice.
首先佛教大乘佛教它为什么讲无我它为什么讲空心它的目的是什么它想达到什么样的目的这个很重要。
So why does the Mahayana tradition emphasize no self and emptiness? What is its purpose in doing so? Establishing this is very important.
昨天我们讲到了我们的生活当中的这个各种各样的烦恼各种各样的痛苦，跟我们自己的这个执着有关系。这个我们昨天已经讲过了。那么执着有很多很多不同的执着，那么哪一个执着是更重要更关键呢？那就是其中有一个执着是最最最关键的执着那个执着就叫做我执我执也就是我们对我自己的这种执着叫做我执。
So yesterday we talked about how the pressures and problems that we have in life are linked, intrinsically connected to attachment. And as we saw, there are many attachments that we have in our lives. Of these, which is the most critical, which is the most fundamental attachment that we have? There is one that is the most important, and that is attachment or what we to self, or what we refer to as self-clinging.
我们的所有的这些不开心的自己让自己不开心的让别人不开心的这些所有的这些事情这些烦恼都是来自于我们的这个我执。
All of the unhappiness that we cause ourselves and the unhappiness that we cause others too, all of this negativity is primarily derives from self-clinging.
人类历史上的各种各样的悲剧，比如说战争还有各种各样的这个不公平的待遇等等，这都是来自于这个我执。
All of the various human tragedies that have occurred throughout history, such as wars and all manner of forms of injustice, also stem from self-clinging.
然后这个我执越强大然后越不让我们去关心其他的人。
As for self-clinging, the stronger it is, the more it prevents us from being able to care for others.
比如说我们我有一个我自己比较喜欢的东西然后有一天我发现另外一个人非常非常需要这个东西那么这个时候呢，我想把这东西送给他，我准备把这东西送给他的时候呢，然后我们的我执 一定会告诉我不允许送不允许送别人这个不能给别人，一定要自己留着。他这样子，他一定会妨碍我们的这个布施给予。
Let's just say that you have something that you love very much, but somebody else needs it, and you prepare to give it to them. Well, it's at this point that self-clinging kicks in and says, you can't give it away, you can't give it to someone else, you need to keep it for yourself. So this self-clinging, we can see, obstructs the path of our generosity to others.
比如说我们几个人5、6个、7、8个人坐一艘小小的船渡一条河这样子的时候呢，这艘船上面的哪一个位置是最安全的？那么这个时候呢，我的我执一定会告诉我你一定去做这个最安全的位置然后不太安全的位置让其他人去做他一定会告诉我们。
Or we can imagine several people in a small boat crossing a river. And on the boat there is a safe position, or the safest position in which to sit. When one's self-clinging or ego-clinging kicks in, it tells us, you take the safe seat, and give the unsafe seat to someone else to sit in.
然后当我们发现我们身边的这些人超越了我超过我的时候呢，我们的我执一定会打击我们人家都多么多么的好，你就不如这些人这样子以后呢，让我们特别感到失落特别感到失落这也是我们的我执造成的。
And if in our midst there are people who are better than us in some way, then our ego clinging, our self-clinging will say, oh, they're so good and you're completely lacking. And as a result, we will feel a strong sense of loss. So this is what our ego clinging or strong attachment to self does.
这个我执当然也有一些正面的作用，但是呢它的负面的这个作用呢，在我们的现实生活中已经超过了正面的这个作用。
Of course, our strong attachment to self does have some positive aspects, but in the course of our everyday lives, its negative aspects far surpass the positive aspects.
等等，就是各种各样的这样子的他给我们的这些负面的这些效果作用我们自己去思考的话，很容易发现这个自我这个我执处处都在伤害我们。
So we can see that attachment to self has all kinds of negative effects in our lives. If we just think about it a little ourselves, we can see that it really manifests in all kinds of ways, and that our self-clinging really inflicts great harm on us in many ways.
那么这个我执它虽然是所有的这个痛苦和不开心的来源但是我执它在执着什么呢它在执着自我自我。那么这个所谓的自我它到底是个什么样的东西呢我们进一步的去观察那到底它有没有这样子的一个自我这个是佛教要告诉我们的一个要告诉我们的一个很重要的信息。
So we can see that self-clinging is the origin of all suffering. This clinging is a fixation or an attachment to the self. But what is this self? This is something that we need to examine further. As to whether it exists or not is something that the Buddhist teachings provide us important information on.
这样子，我们就是要去观察一下，什么叫做自我自我的定义是什么自我的定义是什么？什么叫做我那么我们现在就要开始去去观察这个问题。
So we need to examine what is the self, what's its definition, what is this self? We're going to investigate this a little bit now.
有几个师兄回答一下这个问题你们觉得自我的定义是什么自我，我们今天每一个人都有这个我执那么我们的想象当中的这个自我它是一个什么样的东西请回答一下，我们2、3个人请回答一下，你们认为自我的定义是什么样子
？I'd like to hear from a few members of the audience as to how the self should be understood. Everyone here in the audience experiences self-clinging, but what is this self? How do you understand it? If a few people would be prepared to volunteer their understandings, that would be great.
尊敬的法师我的问题是，就是说我们知道
开了没有？
我们知道，就是说自我就是有5种感觉加上第6意识的一种组合。我们知道这种组合了，就是从我们学习的东西当中来看，它是不存在的。那么就说自我，我们在这里来听，就是说它没有。我有一个问题想问一下，那么第8意识，对吧？我不知道，就说。有些说有第8意识，它存在是一个这个数据库。我听你的 YouTube 上面也讲过，这种数据库它存在。那么如果自我不存在，这个数据库存在，它这里面是不是这个第8意识就自我，或者是连第8意识也不存在？这是我的问题。
好的，这个问题我们讲完课以后给你回答。首先我们大家探讨一下自我是什么
That was just a question that Khenpo said he would answer after the teaching.
自我是不依他，独立存在。
好，
谢谢。
这是一个。
The self is something that doesn't depend on another and independently exists.
好，这是一个。还有吗？
我觉得自我，我算是佛学初学者，所以说我想不到那么第8意识我想不到什么无他，我什么都想不到。我觉得自我就是一个社会角色，就是在我没离开家之前，我就是我爸妈的儿子，这个是我。我在我长大之后，我现在是我老婆的老公，这个是我。可能明年1月份我孩子就要出生，那明年的我就是一个父亲。所以说，我觉得这个我就是在不同的时间。都是扮演着不同的社会角色，这个是我的自我。
好，非常好。
So this answer was, I see the self essentially as the different roles that we play in different life stages and contexts. So for example, in respect of my parents, I'm their son. In respect of my wife, I'm her husband. And when my child is born next year, I will be a father. So essentially the self is these different social roles.
好，还有吗？你先说。
那个自我这个东西呢，感觉到它是后天形成的，就是当我们有了身体和这个各种感官以后，才有了这个我。当然，我对我这个回答也有问号， 但是在我们到这个世界来之前，这个我是不是存在了？这个是我也觉得很有好奇，很觉得。
是，好，非常好。
So this answer was that the self is something that arises after we are physically constituted. So after we have a body, after we have senses, essentially the self then arises on this basis. Although the person who asked the question said that he questions whether or not this understanding is correct.
好，最后一个回答。
And a last final answer.
阿弥陀佛，顶礼上师三宝。我认为自我一定不是一个独立存在的，因为就比如说像刚刚那位师兄讲到，现在的社会角色，我是老公，我是儿子夫妻，然后我是儿子，他都是依靠那个，就是有父亲和母亲才有我。然后如果是老公的话，是有我的老婆才会有我，所以他都是依靠另外一个外援，然后才让他这个角色来成立的，所以他一定不是一个独立存在的，他都是一个因缘和合的。我觉得自我的就是真实本身就是父母的精血，就是一个肉体，然后我们的内脏，然后包括一些身体里的不净物，所以自我它一定不是一个独立存在，而且它就是一个不净物。
好，非常好。
顶礼上师三宝。
So this answer was that I disagree that the self is that independently existing. Just as the previous person answered that our self depends on the social roles that we play, we can see from this that in order to be a child or a son or a daughter, we are reliant on parents. In order to be a husband, we're reliant on having a wife. So we can see from this that the self doesn't independently exist. It's contextual and it's contingent. Our bodies, our organs, etc., all of these things are part of it, but it doesn't independently exist.
好，我们大家就是这个几位师兄就代表我们今天在座的所有人就回答了。那么这个回答当中呢，有几个回答呢，有带一点点这个佛教的内容这个我们今天先不说。然后有2个回答是我们所有人的这个可以代表所有人的想法。
So the answers that we've just received we'll take to represent everyone sitting here this evening. A couple of the answers contained content that was rather Buddhist in its nature, and as to these answers I won't address them now, but there were a couple of answers that represented fairly common opinions.
比如说刚才一位师兄说的一样，比如说我是儿子，父母的儿子，然后呢是老公，然后又是这个儿子的爸但是呢这个就是表面上我们都是这么认为但是有一个问题呢，这个比如说这个整个过程当中呢有一个我字我是儿子，我是老公，我是父亲，这样子的时候呢就一直都有一个我字那么我们把这个我字分开就分离出来就跟这个爸父亲跟老公跟这个儿子脱离出来脱离出来了以后呢这个我又是一个什么样子呢？
So as one person answered, the self is I am a son, I am a husband, I am a father. Yes, looking at things on the surface, we can say that this is true. However, in the process of stating all of these things, the one thing that is constant is this I. I am a husband, I am a father, I am a son. So if we separate this I from the rest of these roles and contexts, then we need to ask, what is the nature of this I?
然后我们回想我小的时候是我父母的儿子，然后呢，现在是老公，明年1月份以后是父亲这样子。但是呢，我们一直都认为这3个都不是3个人儿子老公父亲我们不会认为这是3个人我们一直都认为这3个就是我那么我们认为这3个就是我现在在扮演儿子的这个角色然后呢再扮演丈夫的角色，然后呢再过一段时间以后呢又去扮演父亲的角色，我就是扮演者但是我不是这个不是父亲，也不一定是儿子，也不一定是丈夫或者换句话说的话，这些都是我我既是儿子，又是丈夫，又是父亲，也可以这么讲。但是呢其中的这个我字是最关键儿子、丈夫，这些都是他扮演出来的一个角色而已那么谁在扮演这个角色呢这是最重要了。
So we tend to think that when we were small, we were our parents' son or daughter. Now we are a husband or wife, and next year we will be a parent. But we don't regard these three to be different people. In all of these contexts and in respect of all of these roles, it's always me. It's always I. It's a case of me playing different roles, whether they be the roles of a son, a husband, or a father. And so the sense then is that I am essentially, what I am is a role player, that these roles are all me. So the critical word or the critical concept in all of this is I or me, and we need to ask, who is it who is playing all of these roles?
就是因为我们平时我们生下来到现在，我们一直都认为有一个我的存在但是我们的这个想法呢，它是盲目的。我们这个并不是我们去观察、去研究，最后就是发现了一个自我的存在，然后我认为有一个我我们不是这样子，我们从来没有去观察，我们从来没有去研究，什么都没有生下来的时候，我一直都认为有一个我的存在，那么这个就是一个盲目的就认为有一个自我的这个存在。所以现在让我们回答自我的定义是什么这样子的时候呢，我们确实是有点不知道应该怎么去回答因为这个定义要任何一个东西，对任何一个东西要下一个定义这个不是很容易的必须要有准确的要说出它的特性它的特征这样子的话，我们因为之前我们都没有去研究过，所以我们现在回答出来的都是只是一面是对的，但是呢不是全面。
From the time we were born right up until now, we've always believed that the self does exist. But this is a blind belief on our part because our belief has not come from investigation or research into whether or not the self exists. It's something that we have just blindly believed. We've never examined it. So when it comes to actually defining what the self is, many of us are very unsure about how to go about doing this. Of course, defining anything is rather difficult. It's necessary to accurately and precisely state the characteristics. So on the basis of not having researched or examined the nature of self, the answers that we're able to provide are only partial in nature, they're not complete.
那佛教在这个问题上它是有非常非常有研究的那我们现在看看佛教它对这个自我下的这个定义我们看合不合适我们的想法是我们能不能够接受我们去看一下。
But as to the nature of self, this is something that the Buddhist tradition has a vast amount of research on. And so what we are going to do now is examine the definition of self from the perspective of the Buddhist teachings. And we'll see whether or not this definition is something that you're able to accept.
然后佛教他会说在现实生活当中或者是我们不去深入的去思考观察这样子的时候呢我们的这个盲目这个当中有自我的存在有自我的存在不观察不研究这样子的话那么我们的想象当中就有一个自我的存在
So the Buddhist teachings would hold that in everyday life, or shall we say in a situation where we have not deeply looked into the matter or deeply examined the matter, just basically at the level of blind belief, at the level of imagination, that the self does exist.
请大家专心一下这样子我们马上就知道10分钟之内我们会知道这个自我的真相到底是个什么东西
So everybody please concentrate well. In the next 10 minutes we will discover what the nature of the self really is.
首先第一个我们想象当中的这个自我它是一个永恒的比如说是一个唯物论者这样子的话他也觉得我小的时候然后呢我长大的时候然后我衰老的时候那么我有小的时候有这个青年的时候然后有中年的时候然后我有这个老年的时候但是这个少年中年老年这个时候呢一直都有一个我少年的时候也是我老的时候也是我一直都是存在的那么这样子以后呢我们首先第一个定义是我们认为自我是永恒的这个永恒我们可以简单一点比如说我们从诞生到死亡之间50年100年这个存在的一个这样子的东西叫做永恒我们先不说前世后世永恒就这么简单我们一直都认为我过去的时候我小的时候我老的时候我们都会这么说所以我们认为老的时候那个也是我小的时候那个也是我都是我那我们不会说小的时候是另外一个人老的时候这个又是另外一个人中年的这个呢又是另外一个人我们从来都不会这么认为我们就认为只有一个我所以我们想象当中的我是一个永恒的这是第一个定义
So the first criteria or the first attribute of our imagined self is being eternal in nature. And by this we mean that when we think of our lives, we reflect on ourselves when we were young, me when I was young, when I was a teenager, when I was middle-aged, and now me in my senior years. We regard the self as constant throughout all of these stages. Let's not talk about future lives for the time being. Let's just talk about the context of this life, a lifespan somewhere from 50 or 100 years. From the point of birth to the point of death, we regard our self as continually existing, what we refer to as eternal throughout this period. So we don't look back on the time when we were young and say, well, that was not me, that was someone else, a different self. We regard our sense of self as having continually endured throughout all of these life phases. So this is the first attribute of the self as we imagine it to exist.
我们是不是这么认为啊？不同意的举个手。
Is there anyone who disagrees that this is how we tend to regard the self?
没有人举手了，这样子就是意思就是说我们认同了这个我们想象当中的自我确实是这样子我小的时候我们会说我上幼儿园的时候然后我上小学的时候中学的时候大学的时候然后我成家的时候然后我工作的时候我们就把这所有的这个变化当中就有一个自我的存在，这个我们认可了，这是第一个定义。
So I gather then that we accept that this is the first attribute of self that we self as we imagine it to exist. That is, we see the self as continually existing when we refer to ourselves as me in kindergarten, me when I was at school, when I got married, when I went to university, etc. We regard the self as constant and continuous throughout these stages.
然后 第二个定义我们认为我是一个独立存在的就是我从父母生下来以后呢以后到死这个之间我是独立存在，这个世界上就有我一个一个我，不会有2个、3个、5个我我就是一个人来，一个人走。 这样子，我是一个独立存在我们不会认为我依靠周边的什么东西而存在，然后呢，依靠父母而存在我诞生了以后呢，然后我一直都是一个独立的一个这样子的生命的个体我们是这么认为，所以我们的第二个这个定义是我们认为我是一个独一无二的一个这样子的。
The second attribute of self, as we imagine it to exist, is that it is independently existing. So that is, we're born, from the time we're born to the time we die, we believe that we exist independently and that we are unique. That is, that there's only one of us on the earth. We don't exist in the plural. By the same token, we don't believe that our self depends on others to exist. We believe that we in ourselves are an independent and unique life entity.
我们刚才的第一个定义刚才有一位师兄他回答的也是第一个定义，比如说他说我是儿子然后呢又是丈夫未来是父亲，那么这样子的话，我就是过去我是儿子现在我是丈夫，未来我就是父亲，那么这都是我都是我，他不会说儿子是一个人然后呢丈夫也是另外一个人然后呢未来的这个父亲呢他也是另外一个人，他不会说有这么多人，他觉得就是我，这些都是我我就这个世界上就这么一个所以第一个定义这个永恒的也是这个意思，然后呢第二个定义
独立存在也是这个意思。
So, in respect of these two attributes that we've just looked at, if we go back to the answer that was provided, whereby the self is conceived as the different social roles that we play, we can see that even when we say that I am a father, I am a husband, and I am a son, even though these are different roles, the I remains constant in all of these contexts. We wouldn't say that the person who is a father is a different self, the person who is a son is a different self, the person who is a husband is a different self. The self is continuous, is across these different social roles. So that is the first attribute of the self being eternal or continuous. And then we have the second attribute, which is the self as a independently, uniquely existing entity.
好，这个第二个定义啊，我们的认同吗？有没有其他的观点啊？我们不认同的举个手。
Insofar as the second attribute, that is the self being independently existing, is there anyone who doesn't accept this definition?
有一个师兄啊，麦克风给他，我们可以。
因为我们的阿赖耶识存在着不同的自性众生，所以他在我们整个人生过程中，他会不同的时间，传递给第七意识。所以我们在不同的时间是不同的众生的业力的显现，所以它不是独立一个的。
这个就是偏向于比较专业的佛教的这些东西。我们首先从我们的生活开始说自我啊。
That was an answer that was talking about the independent self not existing in terms of the way that different manifestations of karma take place in the alaya consciousness. And Kumbal answered that it was a rather specialist answer to the question, and he would like to address the question for the time being from the perspective of how we experience self in everyday life.
还有一位师兄啊，但是呢，我要跟你们讲，不要首先开始讲佛教的这些观点啊，我们从我们的生活当中去寻找自我，给它下定义啊。
So Kumbal said that we should not try to answer the question straight off using Buddhist concepts, that he wants to see if we can establish a sense of a definition of self based on how we experience it in our everyday lives.
我是一个基督徒，我是刚刚就是入门，想学习一下佛教的东西，但是我一直就是在想，我是谁？我是从哪里来？全是说这辈子。
没事，慢慢讲。
这辈子爸爸妈妈生我育我哈，那这我一直感觉到，我只是个身体那我之前是什么？我走了以后我又是什么？我到哪里去？所以我不知道我是谁。
好，非常好。
This was more of a question, not being sure, in fact, where I come from and where is this body of mine going. So it was really a question more than an answer.
最后一个回答。
任伯谦你好，那个生活中您跟他讲这个我独立的，我是认为我这个我如果没有氧气，这个我不存在，就会死了嘛。我认为我这个我离不开水，没有水这个完蛋，这个我就没有了。这个我不能离开空气，
是，
甚至于这个我不能离开地球。
非常好，对，
这是我这么想。
好，
谢谢。
好，非常好。
So this answer was in respect to whether or not the self is independently existing, that I can't be without oxygen, I can't be without water, and this self of mine can't be without the air and can't be without the earth. So from this point of view, doesn't seem to be independently existing.
第三个定义，佛教的第三个定义实际上你已经回答了。你刚才讲的这个是佛教讲的第三个定义。
This answer just now, in fact, addresses the third attribute of self as the Buddhist teachings have it.
第三个定义是什么呢？我们认为我是拥有者统治者或者是主宰者就是说我的话你刚才说的我的空气我的水然后就是我的头我的手然后我的身体然后呢这个时候呢有一个我字出来了，那么这个我字我执这个字我这个字就是拥有者空气是我呼吸的空气是我的我喝的水是我的然后呢我的手我的语言我的等等等等，那这个时候呢我们会出现了一个我字，我们认为这个我是统治我的手脚头的或者是主宰我的身体的或者是拥有我拥有空气我拥有水我拥有地球但是这都是我所拥有的都不是我比如说空气不是我水不是我地球也不是我，但是他们都是我的那么这些都不是你，那你在哪里呢这个会有问题，还是要找到最后就是我们可以说佛教就是第三个定义，就是说我们认为我们想象当中的我自我是拥有者然后就是主宰者这样子。
So the third attribute of the imagined self is the self as a possessor or as a controller. So just now we spoke of, my air and my water. We always use this concept of my or mine. We speak of my head, my hand, my body, as if we possess these things. My language, my various body parts. But if this air is not me and I am not water and I am not my hand, then what is I? In any case, the third attribute of the imagined self is the self as a possessor or a controller.
好，这三个定义当中呢，基本上我们的生活当中，我们所想象的这个我、自我的它的这个特点它的这个特性特征，都包含了这三个里面第一个，我是永恒的第二个，我是独立存在的，第三个我就是主宰者或者是拥有者或者是统治者这三个当中呢基本上都包含了。那么第三个呢，我们不再问大家回答，因为这个我们时间可能有点来不及就这三个了那么接下来呢，我们要看一下，那么这样子的我它到底存不存在，我们进一步去分析然后呢10分钟之内我们就明白到底存在和不存在。
So these three attributes that we've just looked at, that is the self as continuous or eternal, the self as independently existing, and the self as a possessor or a controller, all of these three attributes really encompass all of the characteristics of self that we habitually imagine the self to be in everyday life. Now, as to the third attribute, we're not going to ask the audience's opinion on this one due to reasons of time, but we're going to go on to look into whether the self, as according to these three attributes, really does exist. So if you listen, we will yield an answer to this in the next 10 minutes.
首先比如说一朵花一朵花，那么这朵花在我们的生活当中是存在的，我们可以看得见摸得着是一个实实在在的东西。
If we take an example of a flower, then certainly in our everyday lives it does exist. It is something we can see, it's something that we can touch, it exists.
那它真的是一个实实在在的东西吗？它真的是存在吗？
But is it really something that exists, this flower? Is it something that is really concretely in existence?
我想我们没有学过佛的也没有去搞科学研究的人90%的人就会说这朵花是实实在在存在的。
I'd say that those of us who have not studied Buddhism and those who have not done much scientific research, perhaps 90% of us would say that yes, the flower does certainly, really and truly exist.
在我们的视觉当中，我们的生活当中，毫无疑问就毫无疑问的这个有语可以回答这是存在的那么这个回答完全是正确没有任何的这个争议。
Certainly at the conventional level, at the level of our sight perception, we can say without the slightest hesitation that this flower does exist. And at this level of, we can say that that answer is 100% correct.
但是从另外一个角度讲的话，那么这里没有这么一朵花不存在的这没有这样子的物质它是分子原子最后这里有一大堆的能量除了这个能量以外这里没有花。
But from another perspective, we can say that the flower doesn't really exist. What it's really comprised of is much smaller elements such as atoms, and it's, at its most basic level, the plant exists just as a form of energy.
那么这个一大堆的能量谁让它变成一朵花呢？
So this mass of energy, who was it that made it become a flower?
就是我们的感官我们的视觉我们的触觉让它变成了一朵花。
Ultimately, it is our senses, our sensory perception that turns it into a flower. Our sense of sight, our sense of touch, these are what transforms this energy into a flower.
这朵花给我们透露了一个非常重要的信息。
So this flower communicates to us a very important piece of information.
这朵花的颜色是粉红色的那么这个颜色是白色的。白色和红色它真的是存在吗科学家也告诉我们不存在没有的根本就不存在这个东西。
So this flower is pink, this color is white. Do these colors really exist? Well, science tells us no, that they don't. These colors don't really exist.
花是没有颜色的。
Flowers, in fact, are colorless.
那么我们看到的这个颜色是来自于什么呢？
So the color that we perceive, where does it come from?
科学家他会说，它就是一个我们自己的大脑里面的一个画面。
Scientists will say essentially it's an image that's produced by our brains. Yeah.
佛教他会告诉我们，他不会说是大脑里面的画面，他会说是我们自己的视觉当中产生的一个画面。
Buddhism, or the Buddhist teachings, wouldn't say that directly that it's an image in our minds. It would say that it is primarily, firstly, our sense of sight, our vision, which then produces the image.
科学和佛学，他们都告诉我们这个花的颜色是不存在的，不在于外面。
In any case, both science and Buddhism teaches that the color doesn't independently exist. It doesn't reside out there in the external world.
而在于我们自己的视觉和大脑里面。
Rather, it exists at the level of our sight or vision or in our brains.
那衣服的颜色、花的颜色，在我们的生活当中，就是一个这么实实在在的东西这么一个实实在在的东西，它都不在于外面是我们自己的这个大脑里面的画面和视觉的这个画面。那么这样子的话呢，会不会我们看到的所有的东西我们听到的所有的东西，我们接触到的所有东西会不会也都像这个颜色一样？会不会都不在于外面，而在于我们自己的内心当中呢？或者是大脑当中呢？这个时候呢，如果我们进一步真的是深入的去思考的话，那就我们的心里就写了一个很大很大的问号。
So the colors of clothes, colors of flowers, if they don't really independently exist, if they're just an image that's produced in our brain or an image that's produced by our sight, then could it be that everything we see, and not only everything we see, but also everything that we hear, everything that we touch, is just like this color, not independently existing in the external world, but only existing at the level of our minds or in our brains? And if we inquire along this line of inquiry, then a great big question mark starts to arise in our mind.
它的真相真相就是这样子但是呢，我们的生活当中我们仍然认为它是一朵花，有颜色我们一直都是这么认为的这个时候呢，我们的有一个错觉在帮助、在支持我们的这种想法，我们的意识就告诉我们，这个花是有颜色的是白色的，是粉红色的然后我们的这个意识呢，一直都在支持我们。所以呢，我们生活当中这些都是可以用的、可以有的、可以用的我们买花、供佛这些都是在生活当中是可以的，都是存在的，是真诚的。
Even though the truth of these phenomena is this, nevertheless, in our everyday lives, flowers exist. Flowers have colors. we can say that it's our mistaken perception that these things exist that underpins and supports our belief in their existence. It's our mind, our consciousness that tells us these things have color. It supports us in this mistaken perception. So, but that's fine. At the level of our everyday lives, we can regard flowers as existing, as having colors. We can buy them. We can make offerings using them. Doing this and regarding them in this way is entirely normal.
但是比如说我们生活当中卖花供佛我们认为这花很漂亮，各种各样的颜色各种各样的颜色很鲜艳，但是这种想法建立在一个错误的基础上我们根本就不知道这个颜色在我们自己的大脑里面出来的东西，我们认为是这朵花的颜色，然后呢，就这么一个错误的基础上，我们去供花卖花但是我们不知道，如果我们一直都不知道的话呢，那么我们一辈子可以去卖花，可以去供佛都没有问题的。
But the flowers that we buy, the flowers that we use to make offerings with, they come in all manner of colors. We see them as very beautiful, but our perception of them having different colors is in fact founded or is built on a mistaken foundation, a mistaken perception. Of course, if we were to never know otherwise, that these colors and objects are only images or perceptions in our minds, then we could go our entire lives believing them to exist as they do and in their particular color forms.
好，同样的我们的这种盲目的执着下，自我也是成立的也是成立。如果我们不去观察不去研究，那这样子的话，我们可以说我过去是什么，我现在是什么，我未来是什么，然后呢，等等等等这都是可以成立的。
And by exactly the same logic, we can say that without having investigated the matter or without having inquired more deeply, that the self also exists, that the past, present and future self exists in this way.
可是我们如果稍微观察一下这个自我到底存不存在，稍微有一点点这样子的疑问去研究，那么这个时候呢，我们会发现一个非常严重的问题。
However, even if we're just to investigate it a little bit, to take a bit of doubt and examine this question as to whether the self does exist, we will find a big problem.
什么严重的问题呢？原来我从小到现在一直都这么执着这么在乎这么爱护的这个我现在失去了，我们就是找不到。
And this big or serious problem will be that the self that we have been so attached to all our lives, that we've cared about and cherished all our lives, disappears. We can't locate it.
首先我们的身体表面上看它就是一个人一个身体，但它不是一个东西分解了以后呢，它就会变成无数的其他不一样的东西。
Superficially looking at things, we say that we've got one body. However, if we are to dissect this body into its smaller constituent elements, then we find that we have countless entities that we're made up of.
比如说我们拿这个沙滩上的沙子做一个佛像表面上看起来就是一尊佛像但是呢实际上这里没有一个，是无数的沙子。
So an example would be a Buddha statue or a Buddha image that is made of sand. Looking at it, it appears to be one image, but in actual fact, it's comprised of a countless number of grains of sand.
我们一个人的身体，一个成年人的身体有639块不同的肌肉。
An ordinary person, for example, has 637 different muscles in their body.
然后这个肌肉再分解的话，就会变成60亿肌肉纤维。
And if we were to divide it further, we could discover that these muscles are comprised of 60 million muscle fibers.
这个60亿肌肉的纤维再分解的话，它就会变成40到60万亿细胞。
And if we were to break it down even further, we would then discover that these muscle fibers are comprised of, I think, 600 billion muscle cells.
就像无数的这个沙子做成的一个佛像一样，我们也是40万亿到60万亿的细胞组合的一个这样子，表面上看起来就是一个身体，但实际上这里没有任何一个的独立的东西。
So just as a Buddha image made of sand looks to be one image or statue, but is in fact made up of countless grains of sand, so too are our bodies, if we break it down, made up of 400 to 600 billion different cells. So amongst all of this, there is nothing that is no one unified entity.
细胞再分解的话，就是变成了原子然后呢，就最后就是电子，最后呢也就是我们刚才讲的一大堆的能量一大堆的能量。那么这里连原子电子都没有，最后都变成一大堆的这个能量。
And cells, if we're to break them down further, become atoms, become electrons, and then at the very most basic stage is just a pile of energy.
能量为什么变成一个人的身体呢？还不是我们自己的感官就是因为我们的视觉、我们的触觉把它变成一个东西，实际上就是我们的错觉把它变成一个东西，实际上这里没有任何一个独立存在的东西。
So how is it that all of this energy takes the form of our bodies? This takes place through no other means than our senses, our sensory perceptions, which assemble them into one body. But this is a mistaken perception. In actual fact, there is no one independently existing entity that is our body.
这是科学的观点，同样也是佛教的观点。
This is a scientific view, and it's also a Buddhist view too.
好，那么现在我们回头再去看看，我们刚才说自我第一个是永恒的，第二个它是独立存在的。那么我们看看这个身体它现在已经变成了40万亿到60万亿的这个细胞然后再把它变成这个原子的话，那么就是一个天文的数字。那么这个里面呢，现在我们能不能找到独立存在的东西呢？独立存在的东西又在哪里呢？
So if we now turn back to look at the attributes of self as we imagine it to exist. First, the attribute of the self being continuous or eternal in nature, and secondly, the attribute of the self independently existing. We can see that if we take into account that the body is comprised of 400 to 600 billion cells, which can be broken down further into atoms and then broken down further into a number that is just so vast and infinitely large, then amongst this, it's not possible to locate anything that is independently existing.
然后这些每一个这个细胞它都在变化都在变化。那么很多我们身上的很多东西都是一周之内会更新就是因为新陈代谢完全是一个新的东西。那过去的东西这个时候根本比如说一周之前的或者是几年2-3年之前的这些东西呢已经不存在。现在我们的身体它是一个全新的就是因为新陈代谢，那么我们身体的这些就是极少数的这些部分器官以外都是这么新陈代谢所以呢我们这个上面能不能找到一个永恒的呢？没有一个永恒，都在变化。
And in addition to this, our cells are constantly in a process of change. So to other elements of our body, given our physical metabolism, etc., from week to week, or in some cases throughout longer cycles, our body is reconstituting itself, and so no longer its parts are no longer now what they were 1 week ago necessarily, or 1 year ago, or 3 years ago. So given this constantly changing and regenerating and metabolizing nature of our bodies, there is nothing there that is eternal and continuous.
好，再来我们的这个精神，那么我们可能会觉得身体不是自我，但是我们的精神就是自我可能也许有这样子的想法精神也是一样更有趣的是什么呢？更有趣的是实际上我们的存在我们的存在，一个人的存在只有1秒钟的1/1000或者是1/1000。
So let's now turn to examine the nature of the mind. Some of you might say, well, that's okay for the body, but the body is not the mind, and the self is the mind. But in actual fact, the mind is exactly the sense of self looked at the level of the mind is exactly the same. The length of time for which our sense of self actually exists is only for a very short period of time, a period of time perhaps only 1/1000th or 1/10,000th of a second.
人的精神我们的情绪是过去现在未来这样子延续下来的一个东西，是连续性的东西。
Our mind, our mental states are a continuous thing that continually passes from the past to the present to the future.
大家专心大家专心一下我们可以这么说，比如说1秒钟1秒钟的1/10，1秒钟的1/1000作为我们现在的时间单位。
So everyone, please listen carefully. We're going to take as our unit of time 1/1000th of a second.
那么这个时候，我们的心里我们的内心当中开始产生了一个比如说我生气了 这个升起啊，就持续到，比如说持续到10个1秒钟的1/1000啊，10个啊，我们的时间单位大家记住啊，是1秒钟的1/1000。然后呢，我就是瞬间，就像闪电一样，就产生了一个很快产生了一个这个成恒性啊，然后呢，立即就又不升起了。这样子的话，这个时间整个的这个过程假如它有这个10个1秒钟的1/1000这样子的话，我们再看看它是一个什么样的情况。
So taking as our basic unit of time 1/1000th of a second, let's consider a moment of anger or a flicker of anger, a flicker of aversion in our mind that arises and immediately dissolves. Let's consider that this flicker of anger in our minds takes place for a period of time equivalent to 10/1000th of a second.
好，我们现在假设我们现在就是处于这个10个1秒钟1/1000的第5个我们把第5个1/1000的这个时间点就作为现在当下。这样子的话，前面的从1、2、3、4前面的这个4个1秒钟的1/1000叫做过去然后后面的5个从6、7、8、9、105个这个1秒钟的1/1000是这个叫做这个未来那么现在是当下，是第5个1秒钟的1/1000假设是这样子。
Let's now imagine that we currently, our current moment is the 5th of these units of time. So let's imagine that we are at the 5th of these 1/1000th of a second. So there's 10 in total, and we are at the 5th point. So the 4 1/1000th of a second that have preceded this moment are now what we call the past. And the 5 1/1000ths of a second that have not yet occurred, that is the 6th, 7th, 8th, etc., are the future. So our current point, our now, is at the 5th of these 1/1000ths of a second.
好，这个我想说什么呢？所谓的过去是什么？过去就是已经发生了以后已经消失了就是它现在已经根本就不存在这就叫做过去。
So what am I wanting to say through this? Well, basically everything that has occurred up until this point is the past. It's already happened and therefore it's disappeared.
然后未来，什么叫做未来呢？未来还没有诞生所以它也是根本就不存在的。
So just as the past no longer exists, so too does the future, because it has not yet arisen. It doesn't exist either.
那么唯一的存在就是当下或者是现在，只有这个是存在，前后都是不存在的。
The only moment that does exist is this very current moment, or now. The moments preceding this point and following this point neither exist.
那我们的精神，我们的情绪是这样子过去、现在、未来这样下来的，这样子连续下来的。那么现在真正存在的就只有一个1秒钟的1/1000，只有一个是存在的，其他的过去都是不存在，未来都是不存在， 存在的就只有当下这一个。
So if we look at our mental states, our moods, our frame of mind, then they work in this way too. They appear to take place as a continuum of past, present, and future, but as we can see that the only moment among all of this that truly exists is that moment, that is this 1,000th of a second that is taking place now. Everything before this belongs to the past and doesn't exist, or either belongs to the future and does not yet exist.
那么我们的精神，我们的肉体啊，当下存在的就这么一个非常非常短的时间啊，这样子的话，那么根本就没有一个永恒的东西啊，过去的都消失了，未来都没有诞生，没有这个上面精神、肉体都没有一个永恒的东西啊，所以我们的自我，永恒的自我在那里根本就不存在的。
So we can say that it's the same for our mind and for our bodies, that the period of time for which they really exist is extremely short. There is nothing that exists except for this present fraction of a moment. Everything prior to this doesn't exist. Everything in the future has not yet arisen. So we can therefore see that the notion of a continual or eternal self cannot be established.
好，接下来我们再观察一下第三个定义，第三个定义存不存在？
So now we're going to take a look at the third attribute of the self as we imagine it to exist and investigate whether or not this is true.
第三个是拥有者主宰者比如说我们平时说我的眼睛、我的头、我的手都会说我是拥有者这些感官、这些器官是我所拥有的是我所拥有的。然后呢，我呢不是他们我是独立存在的，他们都是我的，但他们都不是我平时我们的概念当中是这样子。
So this third attribute to remind you is the self as the possessor or as the controller. So we talk about my eyes, my head, my hands, my senses, my organs. And the implication here is that I possess them. They are not me, but they belong to me and I possess or control them.
我们可以这么说凡是可以叫做我的，比如说我的手机我的手表，然后我的头、我的手，凡是可以叫做我的这样子的东西都不能叫我不，这个不能说是我，只能说是我的那么这个也不能说是我，这个只能说是我的那么这样子以后呢，我们的身体、精神上的所有的东西都可以说我的全部都是我的。那么这些都是你的那么你自己在哪里呢然后我们就不知道我在哪里了
So we can say that anything that we can refer to as my or mine, such as my mobile phone, my hand, my head, anything that we can refer to in this way, in actual fact, it's possible to refer to everything in this way. It's possible to use my or mine to refer to every part of our body, part of our minds, etc. So if this is the case, if we can use me or mine to describe every single constituent element of our being, then ultimately, where is the me? Where is the my?
我们的身体的每一个细胞每一个原子都可以说我的我的细胞，我的细胞的原子，我的汗毛然后呢，每一个，比如说我的大脑，我的心脏那么连大脑、心脏都不是你，都是你的那这样子的话，那你请问你在哪里？你是什么呢？那这个时候真的是不知道，我们都不知道怎么回答了。
So if we can use me or mine to describe every part of ourselves, my cells, my atoms, every single hair on our body we can refer to as my or mine. Even we can say my heart and my brain, then if even our brains and our hearts are not me, then what is this me? What am I? It's really difficult to say.
最后我们会发现原来我特别在乎的这个我，原来是一个抽象的概念根本就没有一个具体的物质。
And ultimately what we will discover is this self that we care about so much is in actual fact just an abstract concept. It doesn't have any material foundation.
那么这样子以后呢，我们比如说这个有什么用呢？我们的生活当中有什么用呢？非常有用比如说平时某一个人就是说我的坏话然后我知道了知道了以后呢，我立即就会生气我就会说他侮辱我他诽谤我，我立即就会生气的但是现在呢我也会这么想但是静下来思考一下，他到底我侮辱了什么呢那不就是说我吗？那到底我是什么呢？他是不是侮辱了我这个身体每一个细胞每一个原子不是，他没有侮辱那他是不是侮辱了我的情绪精神？不是，这个他根本就不知道我的情绪是什么，我的精神是什么，他根本不知道，不是那么既然身体和这个精神这两个他都没有侮辱，他都没有怎么样的话，他没有说我身体的坏话呀，他没有说我这些细胞的坏话呀，他没有说我这个原子的坏话呀他没有说我这个一个成人的身上有206个骨头他没有说这些骨头的坏话呀他也没有说这个639个肌肉的坏话呀都没有说那么这些都没有说了以后呢，那他到底说了我什么坏话呢这样子以后呢，最后我也不知道他给我说了什么坏话
So you might ask what the benefit is in thinking in this way about the nature of self. Well, in actual fact, there's great benefit. An example would be when somebody insults us, says nasty things. When we hear these words, we immediately feel angry. We feel that this person has insulted us or slandered us. But if we apply the logic that we have been using this evening, then we can ask, well, what really did they insult? Were they insulting this self of mine that they were insulting? Was it my body? No. Were they insulting every single cell that I'm made up of? No. Were they insulting every single atom? Were they insulting the 260 bones that make up my body or the 639 muscles? If their insults were not directed to these things or all of these things, then ultimately what was it that they were insulting?
佛教就他研究了那么长的时间最后他发现所有的烦恼都是来自于一个这个错误的概念，都是来自于一个错误的概念，一个非常愚蠢非常愚昧的一种想法然后这种想法我们所有人都不知道这是一个错误的概念，我们一直都认为这是一个非常正确的想法那这样子以后呢，我们到从诞生到死根本就从来都没有怀疑过我们认为这是非常正常的事情他说我生气这很正常 我们一直都是这么认为啊。但是现在我们深入的去了解的时候，然后我们会发现这个花也不是现在我们看到的一样，然后我自己呢也不是我所想象的这样子啊。那这个时候我们就开始颠覆我们的这些常识啊，很多我们的这个世界观价值观、人生观都会被颠覆的啊，很多东西会瓦解的啊。但是没有问题，瓦解了以后呢，我们会建立一个新的这个三观全新的这个三观。那么这个我们的过去的这个三观都建立在这个错误的基础上。那我们现在全新的这个三观，然后它是建立在智慧的这个基础上这样子，这个时候呢，我们开始超越自我了。
So, on the basis of a very long period of research into the matter, Buddhism has established that all of our suffering is essentially based on our mistaken perception. It's based on an extremely stupid, foolish idea that we have never realized to be mistaken. We've always believed it to be correct. From the time we were born to the time we die, we've never doubted that this foolish idea we have is anything other than correct. And so we think it's normal that if somebody insults us, we feel angry. But when we look at matters more deeply, we discover that this flower is not as it appears to be, and that our very selves are not what they appear to be. This realization overturns many of our conventional understandings in life. It has the power to overturn our outlook on life, our outlook on the world, our values, etc. Notwithstanding this, however, even though it does overturn, even though it does discard a lot of our previous values and worldviews, we are able to establish new outlooks or new values in the place of the ones that we previously had. So whereas our previous values and outlooks were founded on a mistaken basis, our new outlook will be founded on the basis of wisdom, and from this point we will be able to go about beginning to transcend our egos.
证悟了以后我们可以照样的可以生活照样的可以工作。我们证悟的这个刚才我们讲的这个无我通达了以后呢，那它虽然是颠覆了我们的很多的观点但是我们可以照样的生活照样的工作工作生活跟这个观点是不会冲突的。
So once we realize this truth of no self, or become enlightened to the truth of no self, this doesn't stop us from continuing to live our lives or work as normal. Even though this realization will overturn many of our conventionally or previously held ideas, it won't be in conflict with our lives as we lead them as normal.
这个智慧只是让我们获得更加的潇洒自在轻松。
The wisdom that comes with realizing no self just enables us to live in a way that is more relaxed, carefree, down to earth.
从此以后我们的生活当中没有烦恼。
And from the point that we do realize no self, our life will be free from vexation.
只有智慧。
It will only have wisdom.
当我们自己精通这个通达了以后呢，然后我们 就会开始让其他人就希望其他人也能够明白这个道理因为大家都不明白这道理，大家都特别的痛苦。那这个时候呢，我们就开始让其他人也明白这个道理。
So in comprehending this truth ourselves, we will begin to hope very much that others around us also come to understand this truth, because without doing so, they live in a state of suffering. So we will start then to go about helping others to understand this for themselves.
让更多的人拥有这种智慧，让更多的人就是活得这个轻松自由自在，这个就是佛教讲的自利利他，这就是我们的学佛的目标。
And from this point, we will be able to go about helping others to achieve this wisdom, and in so doing to live lives that are more relaxed, that are more free, more carefree. This is what we refer to as benefiting self and other, and this is in fact the goal of our Buddhist practice.
好，我们的今天的这个讲座因为时间的关系到此结束。
Our teaching this evening has now reached its conclusion.
我知道我今天讲的这个不是很深入，还不是很到位，所以希望大家进一步的了解，进一步的学习，进一步的去体会这方面的一些智慧这个确实是非常有意义的。
I know that the teaching on no self that I gave this evening wasn't completely comprehensive or fully deep, and so it is my hope that everyone really continues to learn more and understand more and gain more experience about what I've been teaching tonight. This is something that is extremely meaningful.
好，谢谢大家，大家晚安。
回向 is?
哦，回向。
We are going to dedicate the merit now.
我们最后要回向Sonam da yi dam zhe zo ma nya dom le ni be zha na bang xue jia ji ga na ji wang long zhe ba zhe bim zo lin zhuo a zhuo ren xiu o ma a hong ban zi ren ge zhe ban ma zi de hong o ma a hong ban zi ren ge zhe ban ma de hong om a hong ban zhen ge re ba ma so